Well, welcome again, everybody, onto our Soapbox. We've got our brother John McIver with us today. John joined our church about 6 months before I did, way back in 1981. John's become quite a key part of the Christian Restoration Centre, as well as being a good friend. So I thought it would be great to hear his testimony, because it's quite remarkable, the way God worked in John's life to bring him to himself. So first of all, John, can you please start off telling us about your spiritual upbringing as it was?
Right. Well, I was born in Dunedin, and in New Zealand, known as the Edinburgh of the South. One of five children. Scottish English heritage. Father came from a farm at a small town called Duntroon in North Otago. My mother was actually brought up on a big sheep station at a place called Glenorchy near Queenstown, which was right. So it actually shows that I'm a real Otago boy, which is the province that all this happened in. I was brought up in the Presbyterian church, which was right next to our house in the northeast valley of Dunedin, which is a semi-rural area. Houses on one side of the valley, all farmland, and there was a quarry on the other side and a lovely little stream down the bottom. It was quite an ideal place to live in, actually. I reluctantly attended Sunday school as a young fella and church, although I enjoyed singing in the choir, and I was a boy soprano. You wouldn't know that now, of course. My favourite song, actually, during that time was "The Lord's My Shepherd." And although I didn't realise how true that was in those days, I came to that later. At home, we always gave thanks for our meals, so we had a pretty solid sort of Christian family. We lived pretty frugally because it was just after the end of the Second World War, and both my parents had taken on extra jobs to make ends meet. Consequently, I had a lot of time to myself. I was quite shy in all sorts of ways, but I had quite a strong will. And my older sisters, during that time, tried their best to keep an eye on me. However, I made sure that they couldn't influence me too much by spending most of my free time away from home after school, so they couldn't tell me not to do and what not to do. I was made to join the Cubs and Scouts as a young fellow, and then have a guess who ran the group, who was the Arcala person in charge, was my older sister Joan. Didn't take too kindly to that, but I actually had no choice. We used to have a competition each year. It was a fundraiser called Bob a Job, and where you went to see people to see if you could do a job, and they would pay you a shilling, which is probably worth about $15 today. But I always won that Bob a Job competition, mainly because up our street, about 10 houses above mine, there was a guy that was an alcoholic, and he always had tons of crates of beer and beer bottles. And in those days, you could get a good price for one beer bottle. So I did quite well out of that old gentleman. While my father was very strict, I got away with murder during those years, mainly in the late 40s and the 50s, early 50s. I nearly on one trip, one day, I was actually heading to Sunday school, and we used to have the trams used to come along our main street with the old up to the electric wires, and they used to stop just up from our place. And when the trams stopped, the cars had to stop as well next to them because the trams were in the middle of the road. And the cars had to stop until the people got on or off the tram, and then they could move. Well, this happened just up from me, only about probably 8-10 metres. And I decided, right, I'm taking off across the road. The car had already taken off, I hadn't noticed. And he actually clipped my heel with the running board on the side of the car, which they had in those days. And I fell over, ended up about 6-8 inches from the wheels of the tram. The Bible I was carrying got mashed up. I got grazed and a very sore heel. Got up. The car sort of went down the road a bit. The tram kept going because it probably didn't see what had happened. And I got up, ran to the Sunday school, bawling my eyes out because I was pretty sore, and got through Sunday school, got home afterwards, didn't tell my parents, but then about 10 minutes after I got home, the car driver found out who I was and where I lived. I don't know how that happened, but he came and saw my parents. Of course, my mother got a hell of a shock, and he was John thinking, oh, my father's going to give me a hard time. But he didn't. They were just so glad that I'd survived that incident. I think someone might have been on my side. I was born in November 1944, just before the end of the Second World War. I did okay in school, and I loved maths and spelling and reading. They were my main sort of assets, if you like, and I loved sport, always have. And I moved with my parents from Dunedin through to a smaller centre, Otago town called Ranfurly, and at about 9 years of age. My dad was a postmaster, and he loved the small rural towns, and due to promotions within their system, he needed to move about every 3 or 4 years, so it was a bit of a pain for me personally. He apparently turned down more lucrative positions in cities to remain in those rural areas. He'd wanted to be a farmer, but my mother didn't, as she'd been brought up in one of the most remote and coldest areas of New Zealand, in the back blocks of Glenorchy and Queenstown. She lost her mother at the age of 12 and had to oversee the running of the household from that point on. How long that lasted, I'm not quite sure. And while being an extremely humble woman, she was determined not to be a farmer's wife because that life that she had led, that really got to her. It was so cold in the winter and the opposite in the summer, very hot. My father was very clever at making and fixing things and would have made an excellent farmer. However, it wasn't to be. His love for my mother overrode his personal desires. That was impressive to me. I found out most of the stuff later on, not from Mum, but from my older sisters who knew more of the history than I did. And we lived in Ranfurly for about 4 years and then shifted to Manaia and Taranaki, somewhere you've probably never heard of because it's a little hick town, although one of the biggest bread makers actually comes from Manaia and Taranaki. And talk about culture shock. I had never had contact with Maori before that time. It's amazing. I was probably between 9 and, 12. And I'd never had contact or even spoken to a Maori. And had never seen children going to school with bare feet, even in winter. And in Manaia, that happened all the time. A lot of the kids didn't have shoes, so they didn't wear anything. I got heaps of put-downs about the way I spoke because Southlanders and the Otagoites, the people from the bottom of our South Island, had a particular accent that totally amused other people. About 3 years later, again, Dad had to move on, and we moved to Chiara in the Thames Valley in the North Island, further up, and finished my schooling there. So I attended Sunday school and Bible class through to about the age 16, and then I stopped. Probably the girls had all gone at that stage. My last church had been a combined Presbyterian Methodist fellowship. My father actually never attended church in the time I knew him, but he maintained a very strong interest in things divine. In fact, he read his Bible every day. He had it beside his bed, and I know that he read it every morning before he went to work. His background was with the Open Brethren, once again, according to my sister Joan.
Yeah, thanks, John, for laying that foundation. I think it's always important just to hear about the family background and what was, going to end up being used in your testimony. So, secondly, John, what was the turning point in your coming to be actually committed to God and to his truth? When did that happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. At age 17, I actually applied to join the Air Force. And at the time when I left school, I was actually working as a labourer for a carpenter who actually offered me an apprenticeship. But I actually turned him down because by that stage I had been accepted for the Air Force, and it sort of excited me quite a lot. I joined the Air Force originally as a firefighter. However, my ambition was to be a physical training instructor. However, we were required to have at least 2 years service behind us as a PTI, that's a physical training instructor, because once we completed our course, we became an NCO, non-commissioned officer, corporal. And once we completed the course, somehow I passed that course. I marvel about that for years. But however, and spent the next 10 years and completed my time passing an advanced course, which is called a PFI, personal fitness instructor, and became a sergeant. During my second year as a fireman, while lunching in the airmen's mess, a group of new WAFs arrives. WAFs are the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the ladies. And I watched these young ladies walk in. We knew they were new because we all knew each other. And I looked at one in particular, and she had a nose in the air. And she walked in with a nose in the air. I said to my mate who was sitting beside me, I said, I'm going to get to know her. And amazingly, she's still with me today, despite all my failings. I do get reminded of them from time to time, however. I made a decision to leave the Air Force after 12 years and became a housemaster at a boys' school in North Otago. In fact, it was only just up the road from where my father was born and lived, in Duntroon. They were young men at the school who were struggling in life. Many came from dysfunctional families, and some were borderline intellectually handicapped, just a little bit above. I was actually chosen because of my sports fitness background, and the school had recently built a new gym. The school was also a mini farm and provided its own veggies and meat and jobs for the young men after hours if they wanted to do them. And about 8 months into this time, and just before Christmas, on a day off, in fact, I think it might have been after the kids had gone home for their Christmas holidays, I went to the Coorou store. Now, anyone that knows country stores, they sell everything. This store was the same. It even had its own library, and you could just about buy anything there. But I was sort of at a loss. I was a bit bored, and I thought, I'm going to get me something to read. So I went and looked at this book, I thought, yeah, that looks all right. I'll buy that. I didn't even read the blurb, which I normally do. And I've never, ever before bought science fiction. Well, this book wasn't fiction.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually called, um, uh, this book was about Israel and prophecies about the nation and just how they were still God's special nation and how they would become the centre of a worldwide kingdom on the earth. The book was called The Late Great Planet Earth by a guy by the name of Hal Lindsey. Some of you may know of that. The 6-Day War in Israel had happened about 7 years previous to this, in 1967. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War had taken place. That was in October 1973. And I well remember, especially after the 6-Day War, the local papers had headlines about that big: miracle in the desert. And it was talking about what happened when Syrian and Egyptian forces came up from the south. There was about 3,000 of them with a few hundred tanks and armoured vehicles and everything. And the only thing in front of them was a small Israeli outpost with about 300 men, I think it was. And the Syrians and the Egyptians at some stage got out of their tanks and ran for their lives. And when they were asked afterwards, and this was all documented in the newspaper, they said, we saw this massive army in front of us. And they got absolutely frightened and took off. And the headlines were in our papers in New Zealand. That stuck in my head, especially after having read that book. And these events were certainly quite fresh in my mind at that time. However, the aspect which had the most effect upon me was the prophetic nature of the Word of God, and something I had never come into contact with before. You didn't talk about that. We never did while I was in Bible class or Sunday school. And my reaction at that time to what I was reading scared the heck out of my wife. And I actually started sharing it, what I was reading, with my associates at the school. And suddenly they didn't seem to want to talk to me quite as much as they had before, which was interesting. And during this time, my father passed away, which saddened me greatly because I'd never really been close to my dad. He was the sort of guy that would do things for you, but he could never show affection. I never saw him show affection to me or my things, but he did some special things from time to time, which sort of helped. So I didn't know him that well, and I'd spent the last 12 years in the services apart from them. And so I've spent very little time with my dad as an adult. I had a new perspective on the Bible, and I would have enjoyed discussing it with him. Wasn't to be, unfortunately.
So just to fill in the people a little bit more, Kurau, the place you talked about, I've been to Kurau on a cycle trip Janet and I did. It's a tin pot town, isn't it?
About 2,000 people on the holidays.
Yeah, that's right. Probably a permanent residency of 20, maybe. A small town. So you discover this book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which is all about Bible prophecy, and you get switched on. Now, I just also want to mention John's wife, Cheryl, is actually with us today. She's with Janet on Janet's screen, and John has run everything by Cheryl that he's sharing today. So she's fully on board with the stuff. And John actually gets Cheryl to type up his notes anyway, so she got a sneak preview of what he was going to talk about. So we're up to 1974. You've read this book about Israel, the events of the 1967 war, the 1973 war are fresh in your mind. So at what point did God build on this initial spiritual revelation? Take us from there.
Yeah. Well, while I was at the school, my wife Cheryl received a letter from her mother and advising us that her dad, who had a history of heart problems, he had a heart attack at some stage, was struggling to running the Wanganui YMCA, which was a daily thing, 6 days a week. And he'd had to dismiss his program director due to a number of problems. And she mentioned that she was frightened that he was heading for another heart attack. It was quite a long letter, and I read it as well. And Cheryl, being an only child, was very close to her dad. And upon reading the letter, it became obvious to me that just reading between the lines, she was suggesting that I might like to apply for the job. She didn't actually ask that question, but it was pretty obvious from what she was saying, what she wanted. And after discussing this with Cheryl, I decided to do just that. What I lacked at that time was that I'd never worked with children in my whole Air Force career, or if I had, it was very brief and not very often. And the Y at that time catered for about 200 plus children every week in gymnastics and different sports, and what we called a kindy gym, which is for the little 3 and 4 year olds. And the initial problem for me, however, was a large drop in my salary, which was about 40%.
Wow.
So it was a lot. I was on a very good salary as a sergeant in the Air Force, and even at the school, they gave me a little bit extra. So that was interesting. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, that school, that was originally a farm, it was originally owned by my grandfather's brother.
Wow, wow.
And I only found out 2 days before I left. Yeah.
I've been to where you were there too.
Campbell Park.
Yeah, been to that.
Yeah. The initial problem for me, however, was apart from the large drop in my salary, and what compounded that problem was the fact that in developing the programs, and that's one of the reasons they'd asked me to come, because I had different skills than some of the others that have been there. It entailed working almost every night of the week, up until 9, sometimes 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And I started at 8 most mornings, except when I was running early morning running programs, and I started up at 6. But and I worked weekends as well quite often. We had gym classes on Saturdays, and we also had youth group stuff up at the camp. So I was involved up there. So during this period, I was also constantly being reminded about all that I had come to accept regarding the Bible. It was there all the time. It didn't go away. The other thought was that I should be considering joining a church. But who? Where should I go? The extent of my working hours put these thoughts into cloud mode. Pushed away.
Yeah.
Still there, but tucked away. What I also struggle with is the lack of time I spent with my own children. It was just almost non-existent, because I'd come home, rush my tea, rush back to the Y, run whatever program was on, come home, go to bed, and then it'll start all over again next day. Even at Christmas and New Year, I was busy preparing summer camps. If I wasn't preparing them, I was actually running them. And that was 3 or 4 weeks taken up. I could only see my kids perhaps on one of the camps. And even then, I was looking after 80 children. So my kids sort of had to fade into the background a bit. And I never got to go on holiday with my own children. That really got to me. They went with their grandparents. And okay, grandparents were good. They took them to nice places. But I wanted to be there, you know. Cool holidays, I was running programs as well. Occasionally, my kids would be involved, but only maybe one day. And the rest of the time, I was flat tack, organising, doing it and running them. It all eventually got to me. And combined with a new manager, I didn't want to be the manager. I wasn't that way inclined anyway. With a new manager coming in, who I didn't really get on with, unfortunately. He was completely a different guy to me. And I eventually handed my notice in. And I did it, and I hate to say this, I did it on the spur of the moment. And without consulting my wife.
She knows that now, though, doesn't she?
What I didn't realise until later, it was a stress thing. It was a combination of all the things that I've mentioned, and probably a few others. While I was extremely fit at the time, because I was, come 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, all I wanted to do was go and hide somewhere and go to sleep. I didn't know what was causing that. I didn't understand it myself. I couldn't, of course, and that eventually caused me to crack and to resign. Cheryl was actually running the canteen in the Y, which serviced all the local businesses. So that sort of compounded it a little bit. Just thinking, he's resigned and I'm here running this. Oh, what's happening now? But straight after that time, I managed to find other jobs. A friend offered me a job and to bolster our income. And I worked in different places for not great period, one place for maybe a year. And Cheryl was working nights for a local catering firm doing weddings, 21st, and club activities. She'd only work nights because of the kids and because I was home. Eventually, I secured a job at Wanganuri's first kiwi fruit farm. In fact, it was one of the originals in New Zealand. And initially for only 6 weeks, that was to happen during the picking and packing season. But I was eventually asked by the owner to remain as a leading hand or manager of the orchard, if you like. During this time, I worked with a young lady who had a brother, Alan, who came to help with the picking. Her whole family, which didn't include Dad, worked there and included John's wife, Janet. I think she was only about 16 at the time when I first met, 16 or 17. Is
that right? Yeah.
And while under the vines picking one morning, Alan was out with me. We worked together quite a lot. Who seemed to recognise my quirky sense of humour. He cracked a joke that nearly had me rolling on the ground. And I'll tell you the joke because John asked me to. I wasn't going to, but he said, tell it. And he said to me, he says, you know, John, he says, if there's something I really like about you, I'm still looking for it. And he understood my humor. I just cracked up. And he used that because the next thing he did, he turned around and he invited me to a lecture that his church pastor was giving that very evening. And the subject was Israel and prophecy. I immediately agreed. But Alan was the one that he ended up laughing at the fact that he got such a shock. Because he didn't know about the book I'd read and my desire to do something about it that was still sitting in the back of my head. I attended the full series that Barry presented, and was drawn not just to the message, but the fellowship of the people involved. I attended only midweek meetings for about 5 to 6 months before deciding I needed baptism. Actually, it was someone that gave me a nudge the day before, Barry. He said, John, there's a baptism on the weekend. Have you given it any thought? And so it really stirred it up in me. I only made my decision 15 minutes before that baptism was supposed to take place. It took me 10 minutes to get up to Barry. So I was 5 minutes early. Another brother was to be baptised about, and this happened about 7 years to the day since I'd read Hal Lindsay's book. I found that interesting. Same time, 7 years later.
Yeah. So I'm curious. We've got to the major turning point now, but it's 7 years, just to reinforce the timeline, 1974, when you first read the book, to 1981, where you meet Alan, get invited to a lecture, you finally go and sort of like discover the truth, get baptized. 7 years. If I was to ask you, what was God doing wasting 7 years when he could have called you to commitment sooner? What would you say to that?
God has the one that has the right time, and this time can't be beaten. Can't be. So yeah.
And plus, you were, as you mentioned, you were working. If you'd come to this sooner, you were working every night, so you wouldn't have been able to get involved with church work.
It was pretty much an impossibility for me to take it seriously, doing the job I was doing. And that was probably part of the stuff going on in the back of my mind that caused me to get out of what I was doing as well.
Yeah.
I'm sure someone was in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I raise that because sometimes this happens. There's delay, even in a Christian's life. There can be a delay where God just doesn't seem to be working, doesn't seem to be doing something. But as you said, God's timing is always perfect. So yeah, it interests me. It actually took 7 years for the Lord, from the time you read the book to get, sparked up, to actually the time you sort of progress further. So now you've discovered this, you've got baptized, realized you had to get baptized. What was your reaction to finding the truth? And were there major and immediate changes in your life?
Yeah. My wife was dead scared. But during the initial period, and before I started going to church, I started reading Barry's thesis on the Trinity, the devil, the nature and destiny of man, probably kingdom of God at one stage as well. I can't remember others that I might have read at that time. But I was completely blown away by what I was reading. The obvious truth. I'd read a page and I think, yeah, but hang on, what about such and such? I turned the page, there was the answer. And while I didn't appreciate the doctrines of the churches or the church that I had been brought up in, as I read, or I actually devoured, because I loved reading anyway, these theses, I just couldn't put them down. And I mean, the original theses, about that thick and A4 paper, both sides of the paper. Yeah. And I was truly impressed at the biblical knowledge and the understanding that was being displayed in those theses, as well as the supporting scriptures that demonstrated a cohesion and a relevance in each of the topics that we were looking at. That just amazed me. From my early years, I'd always been an avid reader, which fortunately made up for my dislike of English. I hated it as a subject. I enjoyed spelling. but I disliked that subject itself and generally switched off at school when it came to English. Up until maybe the end of the third form, I was okay. It was after that point when it started to get more in depth, I started to go, yuck. But however, I came to regret that later, especially when I was actually required to produce a 10,000 plus word thesis on my advanced PFI course. So I had to pull my horns in and really start using this. Once baptised, I immediately started going to church. However, I still had a wife who had been informed that we were a cult. So you can understand the pain in her, the worry, how scared she was. However, and she was not happy about my decision at that time. And fortunately, one of her workmates' husband told her that Barry wasn't a problem, as well as his brother, who also knew Barry. And strangely enough, he was a McClellan's. Uh-huh. So that name came up in the background. I eventually introduced my two boys into the church youth groups when they were about 10 and 12. This was before we were, and not long after this, Gerald started coming to church with me after meeting Barry, which probably included tea and a few drinks and a swim in the motel hot pool that was at their place. So he knew how to soften people up. He was good at it. Both our memories are a little bit hazy around this time. There's an awful lot going on. So I well remember being asked by my boys why they were required to attend the church youth group. It was one evening after I'd picked them up from the group. And I can't remember, it was Greg or Brett, probably Greg, because he was always the forward one, the younger one. And I stopped the car. I pulled over right next to a local pub, which is now a veterinary place, and I explained to him the basic truth of the Bible message, and especially talked about the second coming and the need to be in Jesus' good books to be part of that. And lo and behold, they didn't say boo. And they never questioned me again on that subject and seemed to take it on board. And I was amazed. Once again, I think someone else was involved in that. Both are still believing members of our church and accept the truth as we teach it. For me personally, the major changes involved all my friends, especially from my YMCA days, because we had a large number of them who we were involved in all sorts of things. We had a badminton group at our church that I'd started at night and it grew quite large. And I met a lot of the people there, and they were good people, and we got on well. And they invited us to things, to parties, and we got involved with tennis with some of them, and other activities, and people who we were close to. But they had no obvious religious affinity at all. I don't think any of them I can remember had any religious background. And I knew at some stage I was going to have to forego those friendships unless they wanted to remain friends with me. And of course, they found out I was attending church. They just quietly moved into the background. And that fact probably held me back for a few months. It probably held me back from being baptised until I did. But maybe God was in that too.
Mm.
Yeah. Until I made the realization that, hey, I've made new friends who were united in fellowship. And a fellowship that has an amazing future. And that's what overcame where I was at there. I became a lot more circumspect with my language. Not that I was particularly bad before that. The other changes were very gradual. Initially, my conversion involved an academic response to the truth. I could academically see, yeah, this is truth, isn't it? The development of what true love involved is still an ongoing process, as it is with all of us, as is the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. Patience has probably never been a well-developed factor in my wife, but even that has improved.
In your
But don't talk to my wife about that.
Life, yeah, just has never been a well-defined factor in your life. You said wife. I didn't want to give your wife a dud call there, so life, not wife.
In my life, did I say life? Wife,
yeah.
But don't talk to my wife.
That's it, yeah.
I had a very strong commitment to the organic movement for a number of years. And although I'm no longer involved with any of those groups now, most of them accept evolution and don't or won't give credence to a creator God, because I've talked to some of them. The few that do are generally ostracised.
Yeah.
No.
I remember during that time, John, when you were sort of joining the church in those early stages, I remember a minister came to see you and he was warning you because our church, the CRC, we were written about in the local newspaper and called a cult for our doctrinal stand. And this minister was telling you, oh, don't go anywhere near them, don't listen to what they say. Whereas you'd been talking to Barry about our doctrinal stand, and Barry was saying, listen, don't believe what I say. Here's the theses. You go and check it out for yourself. And I remember you telling me that in itself swung you, positively towards the CRC, because Barry wasn't warning you to just listen to him and not listen to anyone else. He was just telling you, go and check it for yourself.
I'm glad you remembered that, because I'd forgotten to put that in my notes.
Yeah, so I thought that was...
It did. It really swayed me.
Yeah, that was very interesting. And also just in reference to Cheryl, who obviously initially, was a little bit sort of wary about what you were doing. I'd have to say, like every meeting, Cheryl is there and, very supportive of the church. So, Cheryl's definitely, obviously, years and years ago now, come on board with the whole thing and is extremely supportive. So, there's no issue with that now. Yeah. So next question, how did God use what you had been doing in your secular life skills to give you a ministry? You worked in the YMCA. How did that translate into church life as far as having a ministry?
Well, I ended up running a youth group for about 20 years with yours truly.
Yes.
And Don.
20 years.
And Brian was involved occasionally too. Every Friday night, that was pretty much a highlight. And eventually being asked to run and teach Sunday school, which I did for, I had here 25 years, but I think it was actually quite a bit more than that, probably nearer 30. Becoming a speaker in church took a little bit longer. However, that too has kept me busy and out of mischief for a number of years. And I'm not one of those people that remembers things well. Never have been in my whole life. And being in my 80s now, it's not got any better. But my PTI career in the Air Force and my YMCA time was certainly reflected in the eventual ministries that I did become involved in, which I now recognise as a development phase in my life in preparation for those ministries I ended up doing. I was well used to being in front of people teaching all the time and directing, which helped me in giving exhortations, although I have to admit that when I gave my first presentation, I was so full of butterflies and possible shaking that, I thought people are going to see this and this is not going to turn out good. It was like I'd never had before, even in my initial PTI days. Yeah, it was amazing. But again, someone calmed me. I actually still get a little nervous at times, which can be a good thing. Maintaining a good concentration on the subject in hand. I think sometimes it's important to be a little bit nervous. Strangely enough, I wasn't today. And I don't know why, because you asked me, didn't you? Mm-hmm. You said, are you nervous? Yeah. And I said, no, I'm not. And that surprised me quite a bit.
That's because of my calming influence.
That's it.
I have that influence on people.
Yeah. Yeah. As with most of us, as we are blessed enough to reach the 80s, as I said before, memory can become a problem. And of course, I write my notes in full, even as I've done today. And I very rarely ad lib, as I can lose my thoughts to the cloud quite easily. And words that I've used for decades suddenly take a hike. It happened to you today, John, didn't it? While writing my notes for this interview, the word ministry, it eluded me, and even my wife struggled to help me. I was giving all these things that it alluded to, and it just wouldn't come. The word I've used for, nearly 50 years. So, such is old age.
It's amazing how God has used your secular skills, especially with the children, to create quite a ministry in the church. Finally, John, you've now had 45 odd years of spiritual development and experience. Can you just share a few highlights of that experience with us before we finish today?
Yeah, I'm sorry I've gone on a bit today.
That's all right. It's been good.
Yeah.
No, don't worry.
To me, the highlights involve around the fact that I've been called to be part of the family of the living Creator God and to serve Him and His amazing Son. That's got to be the highlight. As I mentioned earlier, for quite some time, quite a number of years, the question I found surfacing from quite often was, why me? And I knew it wasn't really right to be thinking like that. It took a while, but eventually it became, no, thank you, Lord.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lord, for your calling. You're drawing me near and providing me with the wherewithal, because He was the one that directed me, directed my steps, told me where to go, what to do, and the wherewithal to serve, and also providing me with a wife who stuck by me through thick and thin and who supported my ministries and still does. That's a huge highlight for me. Being asked to be an elder, which I have to admit, because you and I were asked at the same time, I nearly turned it down because I didn't think I was worthy enough to consider myself to be of that status. But the situation that arose needed an urgent answer, so I accepted it. I don't regret it. The fellowship and strong bonds that we share with people I would never have known otherwise is a constant reminder of God's Spirit working in and through people to mould them and to build them into a strong spiritual house. And that's what I see about us, you know.
Mm.
The songs and music we sing also had a huge impact on me, especially the joyful praise and the beautiful worship songs that abounded at that time, especially when I joined, because a lot of the modern stuff had just really started.
Yeah.
And we use today, there's a couple we've already heard tonight. Lifting of hands and clapping was being an old Scottish Presbyterian boy, that sort of thing didn't happen.
Yeah.
But it had a huge impact on me. And especially, when I first joined, however, scripture, once I understood scripture, certainly supported the practice, as does loud, joyful music.
Mm.
It impressed me so much, I went out and bought a guitar so that I could play them myself. My original guitar had been stolen while in the Air Force. I'm not a particularly good player. I'm self-taught, but I enjoy it. It's a nice something for me to do. As I mentioned earlier, the overriding factor that enveloped me was the fact that God had drawn me to the truth that held together and made sense. And it was almost causing me to shed a tear. The interesting aspect for me is that no one has ever come forward to refute our understanding. And it's out there on the internet today, opening people's hearts, their minds, to the veracity and the power of the Word of God, rightly divided.
Amen. Thank you very much, John, for sharing that. I always find it quite remarkable hearing your story about discovering a random book that you thought was a science fiction book, actually a non-fiction apologetic book talking about Israel in a little town called Kurau. It's ridiculous. And then
it produces all black captains, though.
Well, that's right. Yeah, Richie McCaw comes from there. But and then 7 years later, 7 years of apparent dormancy, you just happen to meet Alan. And if I'm right, the way Alan asked you to the lecture was almost in a scared sort of way. I think he said to you, "You wouldn't want to come to a lecture tonight, would you? Rather than a bold, would you come? And yet you were just ripe for the picking."
Yeah, absolutely.
Excuse the pun, under the kiwi fruit vine. And I've noticed pretty much everyone I can look at in church who's got converted and come in, they were just ripe for the picking. And someone met them, shared with them, and it just shows you, God always gets his man, and the timing was everything. John, I just want to say in closing that you are a dear brother and a dear friend. John and I have this little thing whenever we meet that I salute John. And it started off as a bit of a light-hearted thing on my behalf because John had been in the Air Force and the military, and I'll salute him because he's been in the military. And John sort of took it on board, and he'd say to me, at ease, what do you say? I got that. You say
at ease, soldier, stand easy.
Stand easy, and then we shake hands. And we do it every meeting. We've done it for years and years now. And I've got to say, it's gone from just the light-hearted little jovial thing about you being in the Air Force to actually a genuine mark of honor and respect. And so when I do that, John, it's not just lightheartedly anymore. It's a genuine sign of love and respect for you. You've had 45 years in the church. You're still going strong. I know in your life you've battled quite major health issues with cancer. And even when you were going through that, you may have been struggling inside, but you presented still a very trusting, joyful countenance to the Lord. It didn't dampen your ministry. You've brought up 2 boys who are still in the truth. That's to be respected. I've come to you many times over the years asking your opinion on things to get your wisdom. So I just want to say it's been an honor just being able to share your testimony. And I just want to finish off by saying how much we love you.
Yeah. Thank you, brother. I have to mention one thing that's changed in my life too. Is my competitive spirit has been dampened. I'm still working on my. Whew.
That's good.
We used to play table tennis a lot.
I might win.
And squash.
Thank you, everybody.